My name is John Lobell. I teach architecture at Pratt Institute in Brooklyn, New York. I blog at johnlobell.com, review movies from a mythological point of view at cinemadiscourse.com, and you can reach me at johnlobell@mac.com. This is a sketch for a lecture on East and West, how they may be merging, and it's put together from several pieces of other lectures. So when I give this lecture, it'll be a bit more, it'll flow better than we see right here. Worldview. What is a worldview? There is only one philosophical question. So if you take a philosophy course, they're going to give you a lot of BS about all kinds of theory and stuff like that. But it's all to disguise the fact that the question is very simple. Who are we and what are we doing here? Well, obviously, we are biological creatures who have achieved consciousness due to the evolution of a cerebral cortex, living in a material world governed by the laws of physics. How many people believe that? Nobody. Wow. No materialists. Well, we got two materialists, 3, 4, 5 materialists. Okay, so if you think about it, as you go through school, as you encounter different sociological theory, different discussions of human beings, very often this is in the background. This is the underlying assumptions. This is an example of a worldview. But here's some other possibilities. This first one is the one I just showed you. The world is material and scientific laws. Humans came about through evolutionary random accidents, and consciousness is the firing of neurons. Now I'm going to label these. This is a materialist position. The world and we were created by a creator. Our purpose is to obey the creator. This is today, in the biblical traditions, begins in Mesopotamia, and so we find it in the ancient Mesopotamian beliefs. But today, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, fundamentalist versions of these, because a lot of Protestant Christianity would not hold that. But Christianity, Judaism, Islam hold this position. Now here's another one. There is no creator. The world has always been. I mean, what would it have come from if it hadn't always been? And will never end. Consciousness is a fundamental part of the world. Our consciousness is a partaking of a universal consciousness. Human nature and spirit are one unified whole. What tradition might that be? Anybody want to give that a name? It's Eastern thought in general, and Buddhism holds this position. Now, we can imagine these as subversions of these, or additional ones, or maybe you could believe a black one and a red one. The fundamental existential, meaning existence, the fundamental thing that exists, is God. We should continually relearn God's will. The fundamental existential entity is the planet and its ecosystem. We are guests and should leave things as undisturbed as possible. If you believe that, what label might we give you? You're an ecologist. The fundamental existential entity is the individual human being. The prime purpose of the individual is self-realization. Identifying meaning, identifying one's potential and fulfilling it. Anybody know the label for that one? Humanist. This comes from the humanist tradition. The fundamental existential entity is the society. One should subsume oneself to the common good. Anybody have a label for that one? Socialism, communism, and more recently, communitarianism. Now, I'm going to give you a definition of architecture. Architecture is the crystallization of a culture's worldview into form. So you have these worldviews. And in order to understand their worldview, a culture makes cultural artifacts, paintings, novels, sculpture, architecture. And why do they make this? Why do they invest what they invested to make a Gothic cathedral? I mean, that is huge in terms of the economy of the time for a little town like Chartres to make a Gothic cathedral. I mean, it's a stretch for us to do it today. It took them 20 years to build the National Cathedral in Washington, which is a genuine Gothic cathedral. It's not Catholic, but they didn't use steel. They made it real Gothic construction. It was a real effort to do it today with our monster economy. So why did they do that? They did it to have a physical manifestation of their worldview. The great modern architect of glass and steel, Mies van der Rohe, says, architecture is the will of an epoch translated into space. And Frank Lloyd Wright says, every architect is necessarily a great poet. He must be a great original interpreter of his time, his day, his age, meaning his culture and its worldview. So let's look at one system of Eastern thought, Buddhism, and compare it to Christianity and materialism, two of the worldviews of the West, and start with the cosmos. In Buddhism, the cosmos is constituted of consciousness as well as matter and energy, and all exist in interrelatedness. In Christianity, the cosmos is constituted of God, human, and nature, and consciousness is maybe the soul. In materialism, the cosmos is matter, energy, and the laws of physics, period. Consciousness is not real, it's emergent. It's what happens when neurons fire, but it's not an entity in itself. In Buddhism, time is infinite. Nothing changes. Change is illusion. In Christianity, time is very real, and things change. There's the creation. Everything changes metaphysically with the birth of Christ, and there'll be a second coming when time will wind up. And so it gives a very dynamic sense of time to the West. In materialism, time is very difficult, but probably dependent on matter and energy. In Buddhism, the soul, and put that in quotes because it's not the term that Buddhism uses, is eternal and continually reincarnates. The fate of the soul is dependent on good actions, karma. Nirvana is death without reincarnation. The soul then flowing back into the oneness. In Christianity, the soul makes a one-way trip. It enters into the self at conception or birth or whenever and lives out its life in a physical body. And then the fate of that soul is dependent on obedience to the Word of God or the grace of God, and then will spend eternity at the side of God or in hell, depending upon how it did with the test. In materialism, there is no soul, just the firing of neurons. The one who dies with the most toys wins. In Buddhism, gods are metaphors and are subject to the same foibles and sufferings as humans. In Christianity, God is omnipotent, and in materialism, God is a delusion of those who are irrational. So, let's look at two worldviews. Let's look at two cultures and just see this as an example of what I've been describing. First of all, I should say this is very oversimplified, but it's a way to kind of get a grasp on this. So let's look at the East, China and Japan. What is the Eastern worldview and how is it translated into architecture? I'm going to suggest that, again, in very simplistic terms, there are three things: God, man, and nature. And we want to try to avoid using the term man, so God, human, and nature. In the East, there's a notion that human beings are natural animals and spirit is in all things. So there isn't three things. There's only one unified whole. The notion of there's a God out there who created the world, it's just not, what is that, from a traditional Chinese or Japanese point of view. So let's see what then happens in their architecture. I'm going to suggest that a culture begins by laying down its epic poem and its temple form. And we'll talk about that over the course of the course. But let's look at a key literary work of the East. And I'm going to jump back and forth between China and Japan. So in China, we have something called the Tao Te Ching, and it's by Lao Tzu, Laotzu, and there are many spellings of that in terms of how the translation is done. And it begins, the Tao that can be told is not the eternal Tao. So the Tao is the way of all things, which you cannot know because it transcends concept. So I just said what it is, but you're not supposed to be able to. And then later we find, do you think you can take over the universe and improve it? I do not think it can be done. The universe is sacred. You cannot improve it. Now here we'll take this as an example of a Chinese temple, and the nature flows through it. It's open. And so there's this harmonious flow of all things. And the Tao Te Ching presents the principles whereby we should be living our lives, and we should be living them taking lessons from nature in terms of having a harmonious life. Now we'll take this as a typical Eastern painting. It's a landscape, Chinese landscape, and we've got three things here. We have nature, we have human beings, and we have architecture. We got to look twice to find the human beings. They're here, and here's the architecture. The point is, they do not metaphysically pop. Now, I'm cheating here by picking, these examples because I could find a Chinese or Japanese portrait in which the figure would be in the foreground, for example, the way it is here in Western art. So I'm exaggerating, but here we have in the West, very famous painting by Leonardo da Vinci, the Mona Lisa. Here's the figure, there's the background. I think you don't miss the figure. You can't miss it. Nature's there, but look at how subordinated it is to the human being. So this is a humanist position. We'll look at this again in a minute. This is a Shinto. Now we're switching over to Japan. This is a Shinto shrine. Compare this to a Gothic cathedral. So what do we have here? An identification of a particularly spiritually powerful spot in nature. This tree seems to be kind of special. It seems to have a spiritual power to it. I feel good vibrations coming from it. And so you mark it with this rope and then put a little fence around it so people won't litter it. And there's your temple. And then later maybe we'll add a little shrine where you can put offerings. And so here is a sense of the integration of the human, the spiritual, and nature. So we're going to look at one example, again in Japan, Katsura Imperial Villa. So this was built for a sort of retired nobleman who was not in politics. And so now what is he going to do? What's the most obvious thing we see here? Strongly integrated with nature. So it's very much in and a part of nature. And the building is asymmetrical. It's rambling. There's not a strong division between inside and outside. It rambles, it's asymmetrical, it's sort of open to the outside. An extremely strong sensitivity to the materials, understanding the wood, exactly how it works, understanding the stone, et cetera, et cetera. And the notion that there's a spirit in that wood, and you want to let that spirit express itself. And a notion of space that it's layered. Japanese space is sort of understood to be like an onion of layers. It's not volumetric like ours, very different. And so these sliding screens allow us to experience that. Okay, that was the East. Now we'll do the West. So what is the Western worldview, and how is it translated into architecture? And there's a lot, going on in the West. I'm going to define the West as from about 1000 AD to today. And other commentators would include Greece and Rome, but I'm separating that out for this purpose. And also there's early on we have a more religious worldview, starting with the Renaissance. We have humanism. So I'm going to sort of jump to the Renaissance and look at humanism. So if God, human in nature, human or man, is the highest and is central. So God is a function of the human imagination. And nature is knowable and controllable through human facilities. What's a technical term we have for that? Our ability to know and control nature. Science and technology. I mean, right down to we can take a single photon and play with it. We can stop its spin. We can, the degree to which we can know and control nature is amazing. Now, here is a very famous painting. It's part of the Sistine Chapel ceiling by Michelangelo. And it's the 1500s. This would seem to put the lie to what I just said. So here is Adam. God created Adam out of clay. Adam was dead. There was no spirit. And God then breathed spirit into Adam. So spirit comes from the outside. It's not in all things. It comes from the outside. And this is the magic electrical touch that's going to spark Adam. But has anybody encountered the recent discussion of this? People have been looking at this for 500 years. And about 10 years ago, somebody noticed something. That's a profile of a section of the human brain. God is within the human imagination. Now, Michelangelo would never say that. He'd get executed for that. But he slipped it in there. And we know these guys knew their anatomy totally, because they did cadaver anatomy. They cut up dead bodies. That's how they know how get all these muscles right. In the Arthurian romances, which is our epic poem for the West, epic poems, these are the stories of King Arthur, Knights of the Round Table. 11 and 1200, and they sort of lay down the basic psychology of the West. In fact, if you look at the Percival myth and the Fisher King, it is just about, half of all movies ever made is direct. I'm going to talk about that at noon, so at 12:30. So, just from one of these Arthurian romances, Quest for the Holy Grail, the knights are at dinner and the Holy Grail appears. The Holy Grail is, no one knows what it is. It may be the chalice from which Christ drank wine at his Last Supper, but it's the thing that you're seeking. So the Holy Grail appears veiled. And one of the knights say, I propose that we take a vow not to finish this dinner until we go on a quest and we have viewed the Holy Grail unveiled. And they all agree, and they each entered the forest at a point he himself chose, where it was darkest and there was no path or way. In the West, if there is a path, it is someone else's path. It's not yours. In this culture, we're very big on no plagiarism. I worked with a Tibetan monk who was a great sand painter, the great Tibetan sand painter. And, they make these huge mandalas with colored sand. It would take maybe a week to make this. And we were doing a Tibetan cultural center in New York at Pratt. He came out with his buddies in their monk's robes for the jury. And he looks at, and I'm driving him back to New York, and he says, each student does their own project? Totally foreign notion in his culture. So this is a Western idea, and of course is spreading. Now, it's going to be interesting to discuss this, because is this Western or is it modern? And is there a difference? Has Japan been Westernizing or modernizing? And how do we define the difference? So this is something we can discuss. Now, this notion has the moral center in each individual. So, in the Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, Huck is helping Jim, an escaped slave, escape in their adventures going down the Mississippi River. And he knows what he's doing is a sin because the preacher he'd learned it in school, the preacher has preached, you've stolen property, particularly a slave, this is a mortal sin. And he says, I shouldn't be doing this, and then he finally says, I'm going to do it. All right then, I'll go to hell. So we appreciate that his inner moral voice is a more valid judge of right and wrong than society's rules. So this is a Western notion. So here, now, the individual comes forward. Nature is in the background. Now, what that individual is a long story. See, here we see in the Renaissance, we went back and we'll see later in the course, in medieval art, there's not a lot of awareness of anatomy. They just sort of drape a robe over the person. Very big eyes, because the soul is what's important. But here we are just a few years later with Renaissance art, where we have a very knowledgeable anatomy. So we are a body as well as a soul and a mind. And there's a signaling that we're tying ourselves back to ancient Greece, because this looks very much like a Greek sculpture. And everybody knew it at the time. So we're borrowing the Greek humanism, bringing it into the West, and there's an inner psychology going on there. This guy's thinking, his thoughts going on in there. And then here is, that was Michelangelo's David, here's Raphael's School of Athens, and there's a way in which we can appreciate that, okay, here is Plato, here's Aristotle, and they've been updated from Greece into the nave of the under construction St. Peter's that we just heard about. And here are figures from Greece and Rome and the present, the Renaissance present. And really, all together, they constitute all the parts of an individual. That poetry, art, science, math, all are part of ourselves. So this is sort of announcing that. And then with the Baroque, and here's Rembrandt, the self-portrait, there's an emotional depth. So we continually add these layers to this individual human being as we go through the West. Now, the home for this humanist human. And so we'll pick Andrea Palladio's Villa Rotunda. We'll hear about this from Donald in some detail next year. But Palladio is an extremely important architect. Probably, he's usually labeled the most influential architect of all time. And he's got to be in the top, 5 most important architects. And so this is a weekend house for a retired clergyman. And it's for, go there, read, his library, entertaining. And what do we see here? Well, first, it dominates the landscape. It's not sort of integrated in the way that Katsura was. It's on top of the hill, dominating the landscape, and it's bilaterally symmetrical. Now, it's actually not, because notice this side is a little different from this side, but roughly bilaterally symmetrical. Now, usually the dome announces, usually a dome is a dome of heaven, announcing the importance of God. Here it marks the place where the human being stands. It's not referring to heaven, it's referring to humanism. So we stand here symbolically. And this is very symbolic. You can see how this house wouldn't be that convenient. Downstairs are the kitchens and everything, but how do you use it? And the point is, you stand there and appreciate it more than you can put your feet up and watch a big screen TV. So, in a Cartesian XYZ axis, there's a figure, Protagoras, who we know from Plato, one of the dialogues. And Protagoras says, man is the measure of all things. Now, Plato disagrees, but let's take Protagoras' position. That we know the world from our point of view. Now, Plato says it's possible to know the world from an absolute point of view, and that's a longer discussion, but let's just take this position. So, if we say, well, for example, I'm going to measure where everybody is in this room, and you are twice as far away from me as he is, from me. So I have to know where I am to do this. So if I'm going to do science, and I'm going to, time the dropping of the apple, I got to be there as an observer with my stopwatch or my pulse. And so where do I stand to do this? Well, I want to stand at the center of Descartes' XY, and if we go to 3 dimensions, XYZ axes. And that's exactly what Palladio gives us in the Villa Rotunda. It marks the human being as the central thing, as opposed to God or nature. So we can see the contrast between these two. Integrated and flowing into the landscape, on top of the hill, marking the central point where the human being is. Integrated into the landscape, on top of the hill. Now, you could probably find some Eastern examples that stand on top of the hill, and some Western examples integrated with the landscape. So let's just admit that we're oversimplifying here, and it gives us a chance to sort of see architecture as a response to its culture. Now, I showed you Frank Lloyd Wright's, and talked about the emergence of suburban house in response to industrialization. And I showed you Frank Lloyd Wright's Ward Willett house. Doesn't look like the Villa Rotunda. Well, maybe it does. Notice this sort of cross shape, and Frank Lloyd Wright's got a cross shape. It's got a center. Wright's got a center, but he doesn't. He puts the fireplace chimney core there, so we are pushed out of there. But it's sort of done consciously, so it's sort of, we're aware that we can't be there. And maybe it's a little bit like Katsura in that it's asymmetrical, it meanders, it integrates with the landscape, it interpenetrates inside and outside. Maybe we're seeing a little bit of an Easternization of the West. And we can look at the whole way that Eastern ideas start to filter into the West, starting in the late 1700s and accelerating. A really big one is 1893, World's Fair, where a disciple of Sri Ramakrishna, a great Hindu saint, comes, and Frank Lloyd Wright sees at the World's Fair a Japanese temple. So these things can sort of migrate. Now, let's wind up here, the East. What do these people think? What do they believe? And then how can that belief be expressed in a worldview? And Lao Tzu says in the Tao Te Ching, do you think you can take over the universe and improve it? I do not believe it can be done. The universe is sacred. You cannot improve it. If you try to change it, you will ruin it. If you try to hold it, you will lose it. So there's an Eastern idea. Let's look at a few characters in the West. We want to see what word might come to mind here. This is a book called The Singularity is Near by Ray Kurzweil. He's probably the leading sort of scientific futurist. And he's an advocate of an idea that we are experiencing exponential growth of technological development, which is leading us toward a merging of human and machine intelligence. And it's been going on for 100 years, and it's going to keep going, it's going to keep accelerating. And he writes, the explosive nature of exponential growth, in other words, a computer chip doubles in capability every 2 years, and it ain't going to stop. So we think, well, this computer is it. Yeah, but this is 1,000 times more powerful than my first Macintosh. and said, wow, okay, we're here. No, what do you think is going to happen in another 10 years? It ain't stopping. Means it may only take a quarter of a millennium, 250 years, to go from sending messages on horseback to saturating the matter and energy of our solar system with sublimely intelligent processes. We've got to put these chips in everything. Not, we're going to merge with machines. The walls will be intelligent. Our spaceships will be intelligent. We're going to terraform Mars. We're going to colonize Mars. But that's just the beginning. The ongoing expansion of our future superintelligence will then require moving out to the rest of the universe. There's only so much hydrogen in the water, and you eventually can use all that up in fusion, and then where do you get your energy from? Well, 99.99% of the sun's energy is lost because we're a little dot, and the energy goes in all directions. So you go take Jupiter, you dismantle it, you make a big sphere around the sun, and you can capture all its energy. And when that's not enough, you can goose it up with high-energy gamma rays into a controlled supernova. That's the way these guys are thinking. So I told you a couple of weeks ago I work on a project called Timeship. Our clients intend to be immortal. They've spent over $100 million finding the genetic cause of aging and turning it off, and we're building a huge research facility for that. I just went this summer to a 2045 conference at Lincoln Center. There's a bunch of Russian oligarchs which are funding the building of avatars they can download themselves into. And over here is Seth Lloyd, who says, there are problems with the universe. He's a quantum computer professor at MIT, and he's working on reprogramming the universe. That's 6 lines of code. He's going to redo it. So what word comes to mind? Hubris. So are these two cultures different or what? There's a term, the Second Renaissance. And the term is put forward by Robert Thurman, who's a very prominent American Buddhist teacher. He has a chair in Indo-Tibetan studies at Columbia University. He was the first ordained American Buddhist, Tibetan Buddhist monk, and good friends of the Dalai Lama. He's president of Tibet House, which is a cultural Tibetan organization in New York. Lectures widely. And he put forward a notion which he calls the Second Renaissance. And he says, the West mastered the outer world of material. The East mastered the inner world of consciousness. In the Second Renaissance, the West will bring the two together. So we have this phrase by John Archibald Wheeler, prominent physicist. He worked with Einstein. He coined the terms black hole, quantum foam. He says no phenomena is a real phenomena until it is an observed phenomenon. Buddhism says our universe is a field of the interlocked minds of all beings. So what is the real reality here? And Buddhism, in effect, says it's the sum total of what everybody's thinking. On a kind of pop psychology level, you can say two people having the same experience and one having a positive attitude is negotiating it very well and is happy, and the other one's miserable. It's how they are perceiving it. Well, so then Buddhism says, now think of that on a grand scale, where all the minds of all sentient beings together is the sum total of the universe. What is the fundamental stuff out of which the universe is made? And Buddhism says the field of all interlocked minds. And the English physicist James Jeans said the universe begins to look more like a great thought than a great machine. All this quantum theory stuff, and even what's going on in relativity. So you see these two things sort of coming together. So Buddhism recognizes mind as a process rather than a thing. And Herbert Gunther, great scholar of Buddhist material and translator of Buddhist texts, wrote this book, From Reductionism to Creativity, in which he's presenting some fundamental Buddhist thought. He's talking about a transition from structure-oriented thinking to process-oriented thinking. And he says it was impossible to write this book until recently because it depended upon things that happen in postmodernism, ideas of Heidegger, ideas of Deleuze, and ideas in quantum theory, which gave Westerners a frame of mind that they could even understand these concepts, that you could do the translation. And finally, let's end with two sculptures. On the left, Prajna Paramita, goddess of transcendental wisdom. On the right, Michelangelo's David. Female, male, in repose, poised for action, looking at their faces, eyes closed, in contemplative meditation, identifying with a transcendent oneness, and the David, eyes open, intensely focused, furrowed brow, and inner psychology, a focus on the individual.